At the stage of your recovery of upper extremity motion, when you're ready to begin activating your muscles, we need to recognize that your muscles have become weakened on various levels. In some cases, to the extent of what's called inhibition, and that's where muscles have just lost their ability to respond to the intention of motion. And when that happens, we divert to substitutions and compensations, and your arm never really gains the fluid motion that is necessary for life's demands and preservation of your health of movement, so that your shoulder doesn't break down over and over and over again. So it's essential that we get the communication back to the muscles that I'm going to show you today. So what I'm going to cover is the entire rotator cuff. The supraspinatus, which is most often impaired, often what is necessary to repair in a rotator cuff surgery, and often beat up from the demands of life such that it creates tendinitis and pain. Below that is the external rotators, again often weakened, especially when we start elevating our arm against gravity. On the other side is an internal rotator, not often involved in weakness or a tear, but nonetheless its role along with the backside is to keep the humeral head clean in the socket as we're elevating, so that the head doesn't try to lead ahead of the muscle coordination. Beyond the rotator cuff, two muscles that we're going to look at, the serratus anterior, keeps the scapula snug to the body such that the socket of the shoulder blade is congruent with the motion of the arm, so that it's compatible with the different planes of movement that they can work together. And lastly, the lower trapezius, which is often weakened because of an overactive upper trapezius. So its role is to pull down on the upper corner of the scapula and tip the socket up as we elevate above 70 degrees. And so, differently than resistance training with TheraBand or dumbbells, is what's called therapeutic strengthening. So we're going to restore the communication from brain to muscle. It's called neuromuscular re-education. And we have to have that subtle communication in order for muscles to work together, as opposed to just binding laborious efforts. And so the first muscle, the rotator cuff portion called the supraspinatus. And what you want to do is set it at a height that is just comfortable for the arm to rest in. It can be anywhere from down here, what's called the carrying angle of your elbow, so just where we naturally hang our arm, to all the way up to towards 90 degrees, but generally in the degree of 50 to 60 degrees. And so that's where I'm starting now. And the motion is what's called the scaption plane. So it's just the face of your shoulder blade. That's where the socket directs itself. And so I'm just working out in that direction. And the motion is called an empty can. So it's just like I'm dumping out a glass of water. And I'm just tipping it in that direction. That activates this muscle. If that muscle doesn't work, the deltoid overworks, the upper trap overworks. So we have to have that on from the beginning. Then I'll bring the device up to support 90 degrees, and this is going to support the scapula, the serratus anterior. So with that particular motion, I'm going to just perform what we do when we shake someone's hand. So I'm just going to do a partial handshake, and I'm creating that from my forearm, turning outward as I reach forward. That activates the serratus anterior. With each of these activations, we have to be very gentle with the action. You're going to feel this, and your therapist will guide you with where those are to be felt. But it's not a large action like it is if we're lifting something heavy. It's very gradual, but we have to have that subtlety restored in order to advance. From the progression of that, we come forward and we fall inward, and then we control the motion outward. We fall inward with control, and then we produce the motion outward. Fall in, and then produce it outward. That's working the lower portion, the backside of the rotator cuff, the external rotators. If we want to work on the internal rotators, we fall out first, and then produce the motion back to midline. Fall out, and come back in. Then we apply that to elevation, and we want to start the elevation pretty low. So you go from just straight ahead on the floor, you're working with the plane of the floor, and you want to make gradual progressions in elevation. And so I'm not elevating very high here, but it's that interval of training that you want to accomplish. So within that, we can work the rotator cuff, the initiation, and the transition, and that's what is necessary for the rotator cuff to keep the humeral head free in the socket. Initiation, oftentimes the external rotators are weak, so I could isolate them, but then I can also integrate them into the act of reaching. And that's what traditional resistance doesn't allow. So we're communicating as we're strengthening. The last muscle, the lower trapezius, is if we go forward and act like we're hugging someone. That's necessary from 70 degrees upward. So if I'm recognizing as I elevate my arm, the arm starts to bind because the shoulder blade isn't coming with it, often that muscle is weakened and the upper trap will overwork, the deltoid will overwork. So all these muscles have to have their voice back. And so that's a lower trap. You're just acting like you're hugging a friend. Our brain does well if it has something that makes sense to it with motion. And then we just progress that up according to our capacity. And you don't want to work into excessive fatigue, because then you'll revert back to your muscles that are strongest. We want to condition the muscles that are become weakened. So you work till you start to break down that capacity, and then you do a traditional cool down. So you'd work back down, and you'd come all the way back down to the ground and perform a cool down. You always want to end on a high note. So let us know if you have questions with that, and we wish you well on your recovery.